It's really nice to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conference. I don't have any handout for you, so we'll have to hope I am organized and that you can intuit it. For the reader of the Brill edition of the Leiden Synopsis, its treatment of ethics doesn't get off to a good start. The first footnote of the first disputation that deals with moral theological issues informs us that the respondent, one Arnoldus Scolmantius, was admonished by the classis Thiel for indecent behavior several times. It's quite a choice of respondent for a disputation on the law of God. But at least he repented, as the footnote assures us. We'll hope he repented several times. So once readers get beyond that ironically humorous note, the ethics of the synopsis becomes quite an interesting topic. From our 21st century perspective, the very fact that the synopsis treats numerous moral theological topics, including topics we might categorize under spirituality, is remarkable. The synopsis, of course, isn't technically a systematic theology, but in terms of our contemporary division of theological disciplines, it fits most comfortably there. Yet, among recent Reformed systematic theologies, most give little or no attention to moral theology. The synopsis, in comparison, follows an older Reformed practice of incorporating extensive consideration of ethics into broader treatments of doctrine. It's not as though early Reformed writers recognized no distinction between ethical and doctrinal issues. In fact, a number of them wrote works on ethics, including Antonio Boleas. Nevertheless, as Andreas Beck and Dolf de Velde note, at the time of the synopsis, there was no clean separation of dogmatics and ethics. For early Reformed theology, many moral theological issues were doctrinal issues. The synopsis illustrates this. It not only includes disputations on ethical topics, but also in several disputations deals with moral theological issues as aspects of the doctrine in question. So I'm going to treat four issues in my paper. So the first one, regarding the topics addressed and their placement. So of the recent Reformed systematic theologies that do contain moral theological material, there is no shared place in the system where this material appears. Now, to be sure, there has never been a single way for Reformed theologians to organize material on ethics, especially when it's part of a larger doctrinal work. Nevertheless, the synopsis locates its moral theological material in ways that would have been familiar to Reformed readers both before and after its publication. If we step back for a moment and consider where a treatment of ethics would make most sense within the Reformed system of doctrine, I believe two main candidates plausibly emerge: as part of anthropology when dealing with human capacities and abilities, or as part of soteriology when discussing sanctification. And the synopsis includes ethical material in both places. Its disputations on the law of God and the first table of the law appear after its anthropology and before it treats the gospel, the covenants, and Christology. And this was a common move in early Reformed theology. You give some examples if there was time. The synopsis returns to moral theological issues under soteriology, following its treatment of good works in Disputation 34. It does some moral theology in Disputation 35 on Christian freedom, which is an important doctrinal topic in its own right. And then it covers invocation, almsgiving and fasting, and vows in Disputations 36 through 38. Now, this procedure, too, would have been generally familiar to Reformed readers. Some later Reformed works put the bulk of their moral theology at this point in the system. It's also appropriate to note that the synopsis deals with the civil magistrate in Disputation 50, following its disputations on ecclesiology and the sacraments. Today, we may feel most comfortable placing civil magistrate issues within the discipline of ethics, but it was an important doctrinal issue in its own right in early Reformed thought, and many Reformed theologians placed it where the synopsis did. So moving on to my second issue, which is the selective nature of the topics addressed. The preceding discussion of where the synopsis placed its moral theological material offered little that's surprising or noteworthy. That is not the case when we turn to the question of which moral theological topics it addressed and why. With respect to doctrine, the synopsis is quite thorough. It doesn't omit any major doctrinal topics, but that isn't true with respect to moral theology. The most obvious omission is an exposition of the second table of the law. The synopsis does deal with some second table issues in other places, but Reformed readers would probably have expected the synopsis to exposit the second table following its exposition of the first. Yet after finishing the first table, the synopsis simply proceeds to other topics. Furthermore, even while omitting the seemingly important material, the synopsis is repetitive on other moral theological issues. For example, it includes a disputation on vows after already devoting a disputation to oaths. Another example is the overlapping material on the Roman Catholic distinction between douleia and latreia in the disputations on idolatry and then later on invocation. Does the synopsis itself help us understand why it covers the topics it does? Well, sometimes it tries to do so, but it's not particularly successful. A first example is near the beginning of Disputation 21, where the author writes, "Now that in explaining the first table of the Decalogue we have treated idolatry and the oath, it follows that we similarly hold a disputation on the Sabbath and the Lord's Day." Now that makes perfect sense, but by the same logic, why wouldn't it proceed next to the fifth commandment and the rest of the second table? Second, when embarking on its three disputations, this is 36 through 38, when embarking on its three disputations on moral theological issues following its soteriological material, the synopsis comments, "Since up to this point we have given a treatment of God's benefits to the church, it now follows that we should treat next our own remaining duties." Now again, this makes good sense per se, but there are in fact many remaining duties for the Christian, so why does the synopsis cover only the few that it does? Finally, at the beginning of Disputation 38, the author comments, "In his word, God no less prescribes vows for those who call upon his name and generously give alms to their neighbors, than he prescribes fasting. Therefore, this disputation about vows is aptly joined to the preceding one about calling upon God, almsgiving, and fasting." Now, a reader might well note that Scripture also prescribes a great many things in addition to vows to those who pray and give alms. So why does the synopsis treat vows, but not all the other things? Now, I don't have any grand theory to explain why the synopsis dealt with the topics it did, but it's easy to guess what the author's motivations were at numerous points. For many of the ethical topics it considered, the synopsis had polemical concerns, especially against Rome, and occasionally against the Anabaptists and Socinians. Given the numbers of Roman Catholics and Baptists in the Netherlands and the Socinian tendencies among some remonstrants, such polemical concerns are understandable. Moreover, there was intra-Reformed disagreement over some of the moral topics considered. The longest of the moral theological disputations, which concerns the Sabbath and Lord's Day, is an example of this. Although the synopsis generally handled intra-Reformed disagreements subtly and ironically, it needed to address them when they concerned important issues of practice and piety. Conversely, the fact that many second table issues weren't widely disputed in the early 17th century Christian world may explain why the synopsis passed them over. Even so, the synopsis found ways to address some second table issues that were disputed. I think, for example, of the morality of owning private property, which the synopsis addresses under almsgiving in Disputation 37. In the longer paper, I go through a lot of the particular disputations and make some comments about some of these issues, some of the reasons why they likely address the topics they did. I will simply say now that in sum, I am not able to discern any master reason why the synopsis included or omitted moral theological issues. In many cases, polemical concerns were at least an important reason. In some cases, the authors apparently deemed an issue crucial enough in its own right to warrant consideration, and sometimes the exposition of important doctrines had moral theological aspects. So moving to my third issue, and this is the synopsis is moral theology and the Reformed ethical tradition. So another issue worth addressing is the place of the synopsis's moral theology in the development of the Reformed ethical tradition. Because of the synopsis's purpose to consolidate Orthodox Reformed theology in the aftermath of the Remonstrant controversies, it engaged in little intra-Reformed polemics and didn't seek to bring innovative advancements to Reformed thought. This is true of the synopsis in general, but also of its moral theology. Nevertheless, it may be interesting to reflect on what the synopsis says about two issues about which there was some intra-Reformed disagreement and ongoing development of Reformed doctrine. The first issue concerns continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Covenants. This was a broader doctrinal issue, of course, but it also had moral theological implications. The second issue might be deemed a particularly important and challenging subset of the first, namely the status of the Sabbath under the New Covenant. Now, with respect to the first issue, the Reformed tradition has long been known for its interest in the biblical covenants. This came up a little bit yesterday. One of the uses to which Reformed theologians have put their covenant theology is explaining the essential unity of God's dealings with his redeemed people, while also explaining the different ways God has dispensed his grace at different times in redemptive history. But Reformed covenant theology was still in development in the early 17th century, and theologians wouldn't resolve continuity and discontinuity issues in identical ways. As part of this developing tradition, the synopsis includes strong statements about both the unity and differences between the Old and New Covenants. I don't think I'm convinced that these dual statements warrant the conclusion that the synopsis contains, quote, a certain ambiguity, end quote, on this issue, as the introduction to the Brill edition's first volume suggests. Nevertheless, the synopsis clearly teaches both continuity and discontinuity between Old and New. On the one hand, it shows keen sensitivity to balancing continuity and discontinuity at a number of points pertaining to its moral theology. Disputation 18, for example, begins by attempting to distinguish a number of different ways Scripture uses the word law, several of which are pertinent to debates about the relationship of Old and New Covenants. This disputation later makes the classical distinction between moral, ceremonial, and judicial aspects of the Mosaic Law, which was a key means by which Reformed theologians worked out ethical continuities and discontinuities across redemptive history. Disputation 35 on Christian freedom is also exemplary. The synopsis recognizes that all justified believers through history have enjoyed a degree of spiritual liberty, but it also claims that Christ has granted greater freedom to New Covenant believers. A chief way it demonstrates this is through an extensive and nuanced discussion of New Covenant Christians' freedom from the Mosaic ceremonial and judicial laws. And all of these are common Reformed moves. On the other hand, in my judgment, the synopsis makes some of its least impressive argumentation at several points where it attempts to establish continuity between Old and New Covenants on moral issues. I'm a great admirer of the synopsis, but some of its reasoning here strikes me as strained and even a bit baffling. I offer a few brief examples. So first, there are several aspects. First, there are several appeals to what the moral law teaches from New Testament texts that in context quite clearly refer to what the Mosaic Law generally teaches, not the moral law specifically. And this, I believe, this is my judgment, is just poor exegesis. A second example concerns the synopsis's argument for the continuing propriety of oaths under the New Covenant in Disputation 20. Now here the synopsis doesn't even bother to consider two New Testament texts that, at least prima facie, prohibit all oath-taking, Matthew 5:34 through 37 and James 5 verse 12. Now since this disputation criticized Anabaptists for refusing oaths, And since Anabaptists relied on these texts for its position, it seems baffling to me that the Synopsis thought it could ignore these texts and yet sustain its case. The Synopsis doesn't remedy this when it later deals with the closely related issue of vows. In its defense of the propriety of vows, it only mentions texts from the Old Testament. A similar issue emerges in the treatment of fasting in Disputation 37. Now, the Synopsis is alert to differences between Old and New Covenants on fasting, asserting the greater freedom enjoyed by New Covenant Christians. Yet, it cites Matthew 9:15 as evidence that believers should continue to fast under the New Covenant, when this text actually identifies fasting with the old wineskins that are incompatible with the new wine of Christ. I might also mention the Synopsis's treatment of the civil magistrate in Disputation 50. Now, previously, in Disputation 18, on the law, the Synopsis was sensitive to discontinuity in rejecting what we today know as theonomy, the view that magistrates ought to impose the Mosaic judicial law as such. Yet Disputation 50 is content to cite only Old Testament texts speaking about the Mosaic theocracy to prove New Covenant-era theocratic responsibilities for the civil magistrate. Now, I acknowledge that numerous other Reformed writers of the day argued similarly at all these points. So whatever the weakness in argumentation afflicted the Synopsis on these matters was a widespread Reformed affair. Now, the second issue I mentioned, for which there was intra-Reformed disagreement and ongoing development of doctrine, is the status of the Sabbath under the New Covenant. Now, Disputation 21 is fascinating insofar as the Reformed tradition's debates and developments on the fourth commandment practically play out before our reading eyes, although our author does not write polemically. Now, Reformed debates about the fourth commandment often proceed by contrasting the so-called continental and Puritan views, terminology which isn't very helpful, but I'll use it because of its familiarity. To oversimplify, the continental view expressed by Calvin in the Heidelberg Catechism emphasizes Christ's fulfillment of the Mosaic Sabbath and the liberty of the New Testament church to choose its day of worship. The Puritan view, codified in the Westminster Confession and Catechisms, defends the perpetual obligation of observing one day out of 7 as a day of rest and worship, and hence it emphasizes the continuing New Covenant obligation to observe a weekly Sabbath, albeit on the first day rather than the 7th. At some points, the Synopsis sounds like the continental tradition, at other points like the Puritan. It isn't fully settled in either. It seems to be part of a tradition in flux, striving to balance potentially competing concerns. It's not the least surprising that its formulations sometimes resemble the Synod of Dort's statement on the Sabbath. I offer a few examples in support of these claims. The Synopsis sounds like the continental tradition in its occasional spiritualizing of the Sabbath, echoing the Heidelberg Catechism. Quote, "The Sabbath is even a symbol of Christ and his benefits. Believers rest from their own evil works and allow God on this earth to perform his work in them." End quote. It also sounds like the Westminster Standards when, for example, it affirms that by natural law, quote, "certain set times must be assigned for worshiping God," end quote. But by positive law, God decrees a particular day for this purpose. It also seems to capture a middle Dort-like position between the two, when it requires rest from ordinary work on the Lord's Day, without a strict prohibition of refreshing or recreational activities that don't impede worship. Now, I find much to admire in the Dort statement, as perhaps representing the closest we can come to a consensus Reformed position. I guess as a minister in the OPC with a Dutch last name, that's, it'd be nice to have a consensus position. But I fear that the Synopsis, for all its care and nuance in handling the fourth commandment, isn't ultimately coherent about its theological foundation. On one issue dividing the continental and Puritan perspectives, which is whether the Sabbath originated at creation or at Sinai, the Synopsis isn't incoherent, but is hesitant and non-dogmatic. But on another perennial disagreement between the two perspectives, whether observance of the first day of the week was by divine appointment or according to the apostles' discretion, the synopsis offers a solution that I just can't make sense of. The synopsis states, on the one hand, that Christ ordained it and that it was authorized by God. On the other hand, it explains that the apostles chose and instituted the day and fixed upon and ordained it wisely. Now, it escapes me how both sets of claims can be true. To put a positive spin on it, however, the synopsis arguably shows that Reformed Christians might attain broad agreement on practical Lord's Day observance without resolving these issues. So my final section now, the synopsis is theology of law and the Thomistic tradition. I'm noting that I started late. Yes, okay. And not my fault. Yeah, okay. Now, the previous section reflected on the synopsis's relationship to the Reformed moral theological tradition. The synopsis was part of the Reformed tradition, of course, but it was also part of the moral theological tradition of Christianity broadly. In this final section of the paper, I comment on just one aspect of this issue, how the synopsis's theology of the law belongs to the Thomistic tradition. Although the synopsis couldn't embrace the Thomistic theology of law in every respect, it expounded its theology of law in unmistakably Thomistic ways. Now, we should keep a few things in mind as we consider this. For one, I don't mean to suggest that the theology of law tradition to which the synopsis belongs is uniquely Thomistic, but it does reflect Thomas Aquinas' theology of law very closely. It's worth noting that Franciscus Junius, the synopsis's author's eminent predecessor at Leiden, wrote a theology of law that suggests he had Thomas's work open on his desk while he wrote. Todd translated this work about a decade ago. Moreover, the synopsis, although it sometimes rails against the scholastics, occasionally distinguishes between the worse and better kind of scholastics and counts Thomas among the better ones. As recent scholarship has shown, the Reformation's relationship to Thomas was complicated. Reformed theologians read Thomas and both agreed and disagreed with him, depending on the issue and upon the theologian. Let me briefly outline Thomas's theology of law from the first part of the second part of his Summa Theologiae. For Thomas, so I'm going to do this and you can then see the similarities. For Thomas, first, eternal law exists in God's own mind. It concerns the divine reason and divine providence and is the type of divine wisdom as it moves all things to their proper ends and directs all actions and movements. By natural law, second, rational creatures partake of a share of providence and thus have a share of the eternal reason. Hence, natural law is the participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. The first principle or precept of the natural law is that good be done and evil avoided. Secondary precepts are based on this and express whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good or evil. Third, as people live in communities, it's useful for them to establish human law. Every human law is properly derived from natural law. Fourth and finally, divine law refers to the law revealed in Scripture and takes two forms, the Old Law and the New Law. The Old Law refers to the law of Moses. It was good and divinely bestowed. The Old Law contained moral, ceremonial, and judicial precepts. The moral precepts are reducible to the rules of the Decalogue. The ceremonial precepts pertain to worship, and the judicial precepts govern relationships among neighbors. The Old Law as a whole disposed people to Christ's coming, as the imperfect disposes to the perfect. But even its moral precepts could not justify. After Christ's coming, obeying the ceremonial precepts is a mortal sin. The judicial precepts also have no binding force after Christ, although rulers don't necessarily sin by commanding people to observe them. The new law, in comparison, is the law of the New Testament and the law of the gospel. This law is chiefly inscribed in the heart as the inward bestowal of the Spirit's grace. In this sense, it justifies. Secondarily, the new law teaches and commands. It doesn't justify in this sense. The old law and new law shared the same end, subjection to God. But while the former was like a teacher of children, the latter is the law of perfection. Thomas distinguished between obligatory commandments and voluntary counsels. The new law contains counsels, while the old law did not. These counsels involve renouncing the goods of this world, and they make attainment of everlasting bliss more assured and expeditious. As I now summarize the Synopsis' theology of law in Disputation 18, it should be evident how much it resembles Thomas's scheme. Now, it does open by denying that Scripture uses the term law to refer to eternal law, although it does not deny the idea of eternal law, and a later disputation actually uses eternal law terminology. From there, the Synopsis claims that law, as used in Scripture, is divided into natural law, human laws, and divine laws, which follows Thomas's three categories exactly. Natural law is the light and direction of sound reason in the intellect, informing man with common notions to distinguish right from wrong and honorable from shameful. The Synopsis, like Thomas, distinguishes these notions into primary and secondary. The former are practical principles, and the latter are conclusions constructed from those principles with the help of reasoning. Next, human laws are necessary for a better understanding and proper keeping of the natural law. These are pronouncements of what is just, which proceed from commonly held notions that are like principles and sources. Now, the Synopsis completes its Thomistic presentation with a somewhat detailed account of the Mosaic law in terms of the moral, ceremonial, and judicial law distinction. The Synopsis uses forensic or political in place of judicial. The moral law represents general commands that are perpetually and mutually true, and is the outward representation of the internal law of nature. The ceremonial law is the outline of the divine worship which God demands in the four commandments of the first table, and was arranged to suit the structure of the Israelite nation. It foreshadowed Christ. With respect to this law's current status, the Synopsis embraces what it calls an axiomatic statement. The ceremonial law is dead, and if it is returned to its former privileged status, it would be deadly. The political law determined the duties of the governing officials and the subjects of the Israelite nation by means of certain civil regulations. Contemporary magistrates should obey aspects of this law that belong to the universal law, but those belonging to the particular Jewish law have become obsolete. Now, despite these profound similarities with the Thomistic scheme, Thomistic system, the Synopsis' theology of law dissented when it deemed necessary. The most notable example concerns the discussion above regarding Rome's contention, largely following Thomas, that the gospel is a new law and that Christ perfected the moral law by adding commands to it. The early Reformed hated that. It's also worth noting that the Synopsis' theology of law incorporated some new elements developed in the Reformation and not found in Thomas. Most notable here may be the Synopsis' discussion of the uses of the law. Although it doesn't speak in terms of the three uses of the law familiar to Reformed people today, the Synopsis communicates the substance of the three uses framework. So if we view the Reformation as its name suggests, that is, as the reform of Christian theology and the church, rather than as an entirely new beginning, the Synopsis theology of law is easy to appreciate. It recognized considerable wisdom in its medieval inheritance, but revised and augmented it at a few points as Scripture and Reformed conviction demanded. So, in conclusion, briefly, by my count, 7 of the Synopsis' 50 disputations should be categorized as moral theological, and another 4 deal with moral theological material crucial for expounding doctrinal issues. So while ethics isn't the main story of the Synopsis, therefore, it is an important aspect of its purer theology. And thus, I would say moral theology is a worthy topic of consideration on this 400th anniversary of the Synopsis.